Welcome back to Satori Sounds. In this episode, we're diving into the balance between rights and responsibilities. We'll explore the difference between wants and needs, and how chasing too much can actually hold us back from our goals. We'll also discuss how our emotions and behaviours are ultimately our own responsibility, and look at different schools of thought on this topic. It's a conversation about self-awareness, accountability, and finding clarity in what truly matters. So let's get into it.
Freedom of speech does not have, freedom from consequence.
That is a cracking way to start this episode, because we were going to talk about rights and responsibilities. And so that is bang on. With freedom of speech, yeah, that is your right in certain states, and to think and say what you want is your right, but that does not mean that you can be irresponsible with it. You have a responsibility to monitor and control your speech in a suitable way.
So true. And actually, I'm going to do a shameless plug here. There's enough objective skills out there now for you to learn how to control those emotions and how to handle your conversations. So go and check some of our objective skills out on Spotify. But yes, actions do have consequences. It's an age-old expression, but I think I think in every asset of life you can realise that. And for me personally, I think that's also around holding accountability for myself in a way, because, regardless of how I'm feeling or doing, we've talked about it with sports analogies before, of actually, if I'm not feeling up to it, sometimes you still just got to get on with it. And actually that repetition itself of just getting on and, getting on with your day will over time compound. And so that's one way that I kind of look at it, is having your own accountability.
I think a really interesting way that I've heard it framed before is you have the right to feel however you feel. Whether it's you feel ill, whether you feel cross, whether you feel sad. But just because you feel that way doesn't mean they're not your responsibility. It's not your fault that they're there, but it's your responsibility to manage them as they come up.
Yeah, okay, so it's accepting that the emotion's there, but your responsibility in terms of whether you accept that as the emotion that's there and how you react to it, or...
It's more what you do with it. So, for instance, imagine we're having a conversation and you make me cross or you make me sad or whatever. In that moment of time, I have the right to feel a certain way, but it doesn't give me carte blanche to start shouting or maybe doing certain things. So it's my responsibility to manage that. And it might be my responsibility to tell you that that's what's going on.
Yeah. Well, we can't all just read off, if you're angry or sad, it's probably going to be showing your face. But some people have better idea at it. Bam. Yeah. Well, some people do wear their emotions on their sleeve, but others don't actually. And it is, it's your responsibility. I hope you're saying with that. It's your responsibility to communicate with people. And that's also, I was thinking as you were saying that, taking responsibility of your kind of mistakes as well in work. I was just thinking about that anger or sad. Like I've had it on a couple of times where I didn't set some clear expectations with a colleague quite early on. And I'd promised the client something, and it was my fault that we didn't deliver on time. And actually in the moment, I got incredibly frustrated because it made me look bad. And my instinct was to almost try and blame the other person. And actually, I had to fight my own emotions in that sense, to actually go, I'm feeling that kind of anger and I want to blame someone else, but actually it's my responsibility to handle that.
Yeah.
And actually take the accountability for that. That's my interpretation, I think, of what you were just saying there.
That's exactly it. You can recognise that actually just because I have this thing, and it's my right to have this thing, sure, but it doesn't mean there's no consequence to having it. It doesn't mean that there's no onus with this thing. I can't just go off, to use that phrase, half-cocked. I can't do that willy-nilly. I have to begin to, be accountable for that emotion. And I suppose it's when you start to have rights without responsibility, or kind of these ideas without these things, consequence and so on and so forth, that you're actually not really talking about rights anymore. You're talking about almost entitlements. You become entitled.
So entitlement. That's a poignant phrase, isn't it? Yeah, entitlement. So in terms of I'm trying to think of how I define entitlement of your kind of special treatment. Is that a way I could define entitlement? I don't know. What's your definition of entitlement?
I mean, you've got the generic definition of entitlement, but what we're talking about here in this specific context, because we're taking language and we're making it specific to what we're discussing, we're not just talking about special treatment. We're almost talking about that phrase. There's that famous English phrase, you want your cake and to eat it. But the world doesn't work like that.
So, yeah, the world doesn't work like that. Therefore, you're thinking of deserving of something, in a way, actually, without putting in the effort or the work for it. Yeah, that makes sense. That does make sense. Entitlement. It's, yeah. I'm just laughing, actually, in my head, because I've, as you were just explaining that, I was thinking of another analogy for kind of that, deserving of something without earning or taking responsibility, and that was my shoulder. After repairing it, after breaking my shoulder, I, in my mind, was like, well, it'll just be a quick operation, it'll be fixed. And actually the amount of work that I'm continually having to do to repair and rebuild the strength, I think in my head it was like, well, I'll just quickly, have this surgery and I'll be fine.
I'll be right as right.
And actually, that's I guess entitlement is maybe not the right thing, but in my mind I was deserving on it. That would just fix it, and I'd be fine.
Yeah, we're sort of coming into different paths almost now, aren't we? We've got that idea of deserving and entitlement, and we've also got this notion of, well, we might misunderstand something, and that might inadvertently lead us to almost be a bit entitled or deserving in a roundabout way, and that, I suppose, then becomes a conversation of intent. What are you intending with your want or your, if you like, your need? And that's another discussion. What's a want and what's a need? And all of your wants, we can't have all of our wants and desires as much as we wish.
No.
And it's balancing with others' needs as well. And that's a massive discussion, I think.
That is, that's a very meaty. I'm not sure where to start on that one. But the wants and the needs.
I have no idea. I just said it. It sounded cool.
Threw it into the room. Was hoping I'd just jump on it.
I hope one of the listeners has something to say, because I don't know what to say about that. I don't know why I said it. I wish I didn't.
Wants and needs. That reminds me of a phrase that goes along the lines of, you can't have everything, but you can have anything. Right?
Oh,
so you can't have everything that you want, but you can have anything if you put your mind to it, but you can't have everything. So you can't do everything on it, and so you have to define, and I guess that, to me, that wants and the needs is right. You might want everything, but actually what I need to do right now is focus on something. So, I don't know, you might be wanting to improve at going to the gym, you might be wanting to make lots of money, you need time to rest though as well. So actually it might be that instead of pursuing every front at that time, that you have to slow that down and focus on what it is particularly. So that's how I'm going to try and slice that want and need question.
I like that. That's a good way. Got us out of trouble.
How about you?
How would I slice wants and needs? It's very, very interesting. So my perspective would be to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That we've got lots of things that we need. So warmth, food, water. And then we go to the next level. We've got our emotional needs after our physical needs are met. And we go to the next level. And I suppose those are generally the needs of a human being. And I suppose wants are when we start to get that superfluous addition, where we've kind of got all our needs met and we're like, oh, I'd like to reach a bit more. I'd like to go a bit further. That's what I tend to think about when I think about that question of wants and needs. And that's a very reductionist way of framing it. But when you ask me that question, I'll go, okay, well, what is a need? Well, it's something we need to survive. It's something that props up our well-being. And when does need turn into that want? Well, have we had all our needs met? And what does that look like for that individual or for me, for instance? And when am I just wanting?
What was interesting is I was just linking that back to the earlier point we were saying around responsibility, and actually what you were doing there was that you're kind of setting up that no one else is responsible for you your own self-mastery is your own kind of process and diligence, and you have to take responsibility for that. So that's hearing what you were saying there with Maslow's hierarchy of needs and looking through that and the wants and the needs, is that actually as you keep working through, right, what you're kind of doing is you're taking responsibility for each of those steps yourself.
Yeah.
And as you're progressing through that, that's kind of your self-mastery. Although I also like to think of it in a way of like levels of a game. You know, you just keep progressing and keep moving up. And I used to try and chase a lot of kind of that next outcome, and trying to attain it. But I've definitely learned over the last few years, particularly of actually self-mastery in a sense is loving the process itself, and actually not necessarily that outcome, and taking responsibility for just showing up each day, chipping away instead of just that goal. Because actually what I've also found is when I'm doing it for the sake of just, I don't know, enjoying it or taking that responsibility, I do it a lot more than just chasing the outcome.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. It kind of becomes eudaimonia, that Nico Mancinian kind of conversation we had before around Aristotle's ethics. Actually, what you're saying is, when is what I'm doing enough for me? When is that generating that sense of well-being? The simple thing, I do it because I like to do it. And when you're coming out of that frame. And Robert Greene is really interesting in his book, 48 Laws of Power. Whatever you feel about that piece of work, he does have a rule, and I can't remember the phrasing, and I cannot remember the number either, but it is in there. And he talks about this concept of overreaching, and how when your wants push you to overreach, and how that can lead to catastrophe.
I just reflecting on what you're saying there with catastrophe. So it's
a very dramatic word, isn't it?
Because you've no, but I what you're saying is because you've taken you're going after so many things that ultimately leads to the collapse in a sense.
Yeah.
Well, it does. You can't focus on everything in that regard, can you? You know, and if you spread yourself too thin, I mean, I think of a very simple kind of methodology, but it might paint a picture for some of the listeners. I was managing a construction project, and it was behind on time, overspent on money, huge pressure around it, and my boss said one of the biggest risks we have at this point is the risk of overexposure and opening ourselves up on multiple work fronts. Oh. And I was a bit like, what does that mean? But what it basically means is that construction's a sequence and a reason, right? And certain tasks have to be done at a certain point in time. Mm. And what I'm hearing with your point around kind of that kind of all things crashing down is, if you're opening yourself up on too many work fronts, actually what will happen is you'll get to a point where things are almost tripping over themselves, or actually you haven't got the resources to deploy around everywhere to keep yourself on track to keep productive. So actually you'll start almost failing everywhere. And we were very much at risk for that. Because what you'd find is that, I don't know, very simply, you'd have a couple of bricklayers in different places, but then the next trade that would follow them actually was already spread too thin. And so actually what happened was we lost more time because of it. But in our minds, if we'd originally opened up and done more work, well, more work must immediately mean more outcome. So that for me is how I'm interpreting, I guess, what you were just saying about that catastrophe.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, we can even think about it in that kind of language, just using that wants and needs. Well, what were the needs of the company in that time? Well, they want to kind of lead production to, I don't know what the building was, but build a building or kind of provide a service to someone. And actually the desire for more took you away from that. You spread yourself too thin. Mm. And that leads to the slowing down of production, which stops you attaining your original goal.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm wondering, bring it back to the self in a way, right? Is that I think we can all do that. We can probably acknowledge where we've spread ourselves too thin. And actually, you almost don't want to accept or take that responsibility, realizing you've done it, you know, a burnout or doing that. Or I'll tell you what I hate personally, or don't hate anymore. I used to, was asking for help and actually taking that responsibility on, because I thought if I had to ask for help that I was kind of, you know, failing in a way. And actually, you know, I've got more comfortable. I'm not going to say I'm not completely fine with it, but getting more comfortable that actually it's okay just to ask for help from people.
And I think there's a lot to be said for that. And that example makes me think about the work of Thomas Hegel. Now, Thomas Hegel is a very famous philosopher. Granted, there's a lot surrounding Thomas Hegel, humorously, with everything that's gone on with these split camps of philosophy. And if you're interested in that, go away, look up Zizek, maybe look up Chomsky, and you'll kind of see maybe some of the fallout from those two and come to your own conclusions as a listener. But Hegel's philosophy pretty much was concerned with rights, and it was concerned with rights in the context of people's freedoms. And I like to think about your example there of, well, when is our wants now starting to encroach on our freedom? When is that sense of burnout encroached on your freedom to live how you want to live, your freedom how to be how you want to be? And there's also another element. When has your want also impacted on someone else's freedom? And there's lots of ways to slice that. So you came at it from that internal point of view of, actually, spreading myself too thin has meant I can't live the life I want to live. And I can't ask for help because I've failed. And that's almost bound you up in this chain, basically. And you're stuck in that position. So your freedom has been limited. And it's thinking about that in other elements as well.
Yeah. The others bit, could you give an example on that in your mind? Of you were just saying about with others. I've forgotten the exact frame you just said there, actually.
So we're talking about rights and how they effectively relate to freedom, and how our wants might start to encroach on other people's rights and freedoms.
That was it.
Well, there's lots of ways to think about that. The common one might be, imagine, you're at a party, and you think about them in social graces almost all the time. So if someone doesn't give way, for instance, everyone gets very cross. They're like, "Oh, how dare you!" And it's that impact.
That's very British of us.
Exceedingly British, quintessentially British.
Sorry to cut you off there.
More British than an M&S ad. That's what we advocate here. No, but it is that sort of sense of, we all feel it, and we feel it kind of that's a very minor example, but there are massive examples. So imagine someone steals from you, for instance. That's a breach of your right to have property. And you feel very aggrieved. Their want has taken over your life. And I once heard a colleague of mine frame aggression like this. Aggression is when someone asserts their needs without consent over you.
Wow. That's
so you haven't discussed
asserting their needs over you.
Forced it upon you. And sometimes it's not need, sometimes it's wants. Someone has just come in and been like, "I want this, I'm taking it. I'm having it."
Yeah. That's a very vivid way of describing that. I'm trying to think of more examples around those emotions you've got on that personal. That actually reminds me of a similar conversation. You've talked about the angry there, but also another one around being sad, where I had a good friend who kind of, I checked in with them, see how they were doing, and they said, "Oh, I said I'm really down the other month," and I was like, "Oh, really? What's going on?" And they said, "I got really sad because a number of people who I thought would have reached out my birthday to say happy birthday didn't." And it was like, okay, I don't know. It really took me back, because I guess as much as you do want these people to say happy birthday to you and these other things and check in, for me in the instant, especially to my close friends, I don't think I can look at that as a whole relationship and say, because you didn't say happy birthday to me on that particular day, I'm going to feel sad from that. But I think there's a lot of things that we could probably do on that, right, as well. If I'm sitting here sad and you haven't reached out to me and checked in with me that day, maybe I could easily take that on myself with those feelings. Going back to what you said at the start of this conversation, is actually I'm sitting there feeling sad, but actually it's kind of my responsibility to, if I feel there's enough of a need, to maybe reach out to you and say, "Oh, dude, I would have really appreciated checking. I wasn't feeling too great," or seeing whether you were able to. So I think a lot of people have probably done that with a number of their emotions, actually, is we've probably taken on an emotion, but actually we need to have that responsibility to check in with that emotion and see, is it not relevant, but is there something that I need to do about that? Or maybe is that something that I just need to kind of let go?
I suppose it's how you voice it, isn't it, really? And it comes back to that statement, is your need or want, are you beginning to assert that without consent over someone else? So that sadness, so imagine, I don't know, you don't say hello or happy birthday to me on my birthday.
When is your birthday again?
I have no idea. I don't even keep track.
It's just because the age listeners, we're just too old. We don't want to keep track of our birthdays.
You're too old. I moisturise every day.
Oh.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I suppose coming away from that, it's how you raise it. And if I'm asserting, well, I'm sad because you didn't do this, and if I do it in a particular way, if I do it in a blaming way, if I do it in a way where I'm trying to get something from you, you're going to shut that down. Mm-hmm. And it's thinking about, well, what's an alternative way of saying that? So it might be something like, using an I statement, which is I'm not going to go through the formula exactly, and you can go away and you can look them up, or maybe we'll do an objective skill on I statements. But it's thinking about, how do I get my needs met without aggressively asserting them over someone else?
I think that's definitely got to be an objective skill.
What, an I statement?
Well, just how do I get my needs met without aggressively asserting it? That's
the dear man skill. That's part of that.
Oh, there you go.
It's the relational effectiveness. Do your homework, listeners.
He's talking to me there as well. I obviously didn't realise it was all in the dear man. That wasn't aimed at listeners. There was some aggressive assertion there.
Absolutely.
But he deflected it.
Read the skills. Honestly.
There's just so much good content. I can't keep on top of all of it. We're just pumping out too much.
It's true. Little content factories.
Yeah, that's that responsibility, though. I think we can apply it in a number of ways. I've got an example of time where I've had it with as I was learning to step up, and kind of as a project manager, you typically start at a lower level where you've got a lot of more admin tasks, and then you take on a little bit more responsibility, and you're responsible for some of the day-to-day stuff. Mm-hmm. And then you step into more of a senior role where you're kind of overseeing the project, and then you get to this point where you're kind of not really in the day-to-day delivery, and you're more into the running of the business and winning work, etc. And that bit, stepping up from being responsible day-to-day into that leadership position, was probably one of the hardest things I'd learned. And actually, what I found was that I was just getting stuck in some of the lower level tasks that actually I shouldn't be involved in. But it was because I was still taking that responsibility, right? And I was just telling people what to do. They were doing it, then they were coming back. And so actually I wasn't devolving into that responsibility for allowing other people to step up, but it also meant that I wasn't taking on the responsibility of the roles that I should have been doing. And so something that I actually learned around was actually agreeing the outcome of what is it we need to try and achieve here, then letting the other person take that responsibility for it and feeding back to me. And if they need the help, trying to coach them into how to deliver it so that next time they can do it themselves. And that, that freed up a lot of time for me. And there's a model, which I'm going to have to go away and look at, but it's this curve around coaching, supporting, delegate or directing.
Is it a supervision model?
I'm going to have to
put in the show notes.
I'll say it's going to have to be in the show notes. I can visualize it because I've used it, but it's around basic competence. And if someone's relatively low competence, that actually you might need to be a bit more directive. Whereas actually, if they're super high competence, then you can just be a bit more delegative and just give them that. But yeah, taking that responsibility for myself. And actually, applying it to the role that I'm doing and stepping out a little bit enabled me to be more successful. Whereas before I was taught that skill and I didn't take on I was always blaming it. Well, I can't step up because I'm too busy, And actually, until I'd learned the tools and taken the responsibility before it, I was just stuck at that point of, not really succeeding and not really delivering.
I think it's worth saying that the higher level of autonomy that happens in your role or kind of that you get in your life, the higher the degree of self-determination, which also comes with a higher level of responsibility. So to repeat that, the more personal freedoms that you enjoy generally and the more ability you have to make decisions, the greater the level of responsibility. And when you think about that phrase, I want you to think about Spider-Man, Uncle Ben. With great power comes great responsibility. And there's no greater power than making decisions. So when you're making a decision, whatever it is, well, there's a consequence to that. And you might have the responsibility to prevent that consequence, or you might have a responsibility to, do the right thing or do something good. And it's kind of weighing that up.
Yeah, very much so. And it loops right back round to actions have consequences, actually, doesn't it?
Doesn't it? The moral imperative in many ways.
Yeah, very much so. But the decision, those decisions, comes with, that great responsibility as you were framing it there. You can also look at that in your day-to-day life as well, because we all have this finite amount of time and energy. You've used the great example before of spoons in the drawer, right? But I look to make a lot of the decisions that I need to make in a day earlier on, because by the end of the day, I don't have it. So actually, that responsibility of, I know I've got to make some key decisions today, setting that up at appropriate time in the day is the right thing to do for me. And I think you can apply that to all aspects of your life in a way of, if you're going to take that responsibility and making those decisions, you've got to keep yourself accountable, but also understand when's the right time to make a decision, or sometimes does a decision even need to be made? Sometimes, it might be a responsibility to go, actually, I'm not going to get embroiled in that, or I'm just going to step away because, we can have anything, but we can't have everything.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really good way of framing it. You can have anything, but you can't have it all. And it's that old English idiom, can't have your cake and eat it. You can want the cake and you can eat it, but you can't have both.
Very true. Josh, are you hungry?
I'm starving.
Dude needs cake. Can someone get him some cake?
Yeah, I'm a unit. You think these muscles happen by mistake?
It's I can't. Well, I'm just speechless to that. Absolutely speechless. It's. I just think about you stuffing loads of cake. I've lost myself.
It's your responsibility to bring yourself back to this podcast. Stop thinking about me and the cake.
That is a good visual.
What me eating cake.
Yeah, we're just going to put that as the logo of this episode. No context. If people want to find out what it is, they're going to have to click through and just see it.
Maybe we should just rename the podcast Cake and Muscles.
Cake and Muscles.